The Golden Age. This lecture is the third lecture for Western Civilization 1. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the political stability that was created by Augustus and the five good emperors of the Roman civilization, how Roman civilization flourished during this period. And basically, it's the period of the Pax Romana. In this lecture, we're going to cover the cultural, social, intellectual, and technological achievements of the Romans during the period. And one thing that might be helpful for you to consider while listening to this lecture, and you may even want to follow along with it or have it readily available, is the story of Bythus, the Roman soldier, which is on pages 164 to 165 of your textbook. Bythus, Bythus was a soldier who had served in the military and the Roman military, and he was from Thrace in Greece. And there's nothing particularly remarkable about him as far as his life. His life was typical of that of any other Roman soldier. He first served, he served in the auxiliaries, a secondary force comprised of non-citizens of the Roman Empire. And he was taken way far away from his native lands. He would have trained and learned how to march and use the standard weapons of the army. And then once his training was over, he spent the majority of his career in what is now the nation of Syria. And it was here that he would have had contact with soldiers from all over the empire, from Gaul, from Spain, from West Africa. And in any case, at the conclusion of his career, he is rewarded with his diploma that basically rewards him with citizenship. And that was actually an incentive for joining the Roman Empire, was a grant of citizenship after 25 years of service in the Roman army. But during that time in the Roman army, soldiers would have had contact with people from all over the empire, so there would have been opportunities for cultural blending. And you would also find not just that, but the spreading of culture. The army had certain standards put in place by the Romans, and those were found throughout the empire. And so this really serves a model for what this lecture is really about. The first part of the lecture is commerce. What impact did the Pax Romana have on the Roman Empire? What impact did this Roman peace, this stability, what impact did it have? Well, the Romans, they pacified the Mediterranean, and they basically created an empire that enabled them to protect overseas and overland trade routes. And this expanded greatly the number of opportunities in the Roman Empire that existed for trade and the products that were being traded. The Roman economy expanded greatly because of its size and because of the ability of the Roman Empire to keep the peace within those borders. That alone will help Rome greatly. Not only will it do this, it'll actually do a number of other things. One of the things the Roman army will do in unifying this empire is they will actually bring kind of a standardization to the peoples around the empire, bringing Roman culture. And one way that that's seen is in Roman cities. Roman cities were pretty much standardized. They were generally grid planned north-south, roads connecting them to other cities. Every city had different residential districts with a forum, with a temple, and then an amphitheater, place for gladiatorial events. These things were provided in every city. And you would also see, because of the relative peace in the empire, created in part by these armies, you'll actually see a standard of living that will be raised considerably, due in part to, one, the roads, which will help facilitate trade, two, the public works projects, especially things like aqueducts and sewer systems. They're going to improve everyone's living conditions regardless of social class. Even lower class citizens would be able, in some cases, in some parts of the empire, during this relative peace, would be able to afford at least one slave. Slaves were pretty much the only ones who would not see any of the economic benefits of this period. But freeing one's slaves was actually fairly common at this time, and becoming more common at this time. Now, culturally, Rome was impacted greatly. The Roman Empire impacted those they came into contact with greatly. Now, Roman culture never replaced local cultures, but the provinces did adapt certain aspects of Roman society that they found useful. Roman engineering, for instance, became very, very influential. Roman engineering improved living conditions in most Roman cities, and as I said, Roman cities were pretty much standardized. Better roads, better aqueducts, they benefited everyone. So that was one impact in engineering. It's hard to think of that as a cultural impact, but it was in fact very much so. It was something that the aqueducts, the construction of the aqueducts, will be influential to the construction of other buildings in those areas. Not just the ones the Romans built, but later on they'll be influential in the building of churches and castles, that sort of thing. But in Rome itself, it will have a considerable impact. Latin will merge with the local languages and eventually lead to the creation of modern Romance languages. And you can actually see this here. The Romance languages today, places like France, Spain, Portugal, Romania, those will be the dominant. Those will be areas that were at one time controlled by Rome, and that Rome had a degree of influence over. And that fusion of Latin and the local languages is what created those languages, and there is still practiced today. Another thing Roman society, the impact of Roman society had in other cultures were sporting events, especially gladiatorial events. You could find every single city in the Roman Empire had some sort of stadium, coliseum, for these type of events. They were very popular throughout the empire, and this was one thing that the empire imparted to the peoples that they conquered. that they ruled over. So it's also another thing that's important to consider is that by the time you get to Augustus Caesar, many of the provinces that the Romans have by his rule had been in the empire for 100 years. By the time you get towards the end of the five good emperors, you're talking about at least 100 years for just about every Roman province at the time. So the Romans were familiar with the people that they were ruling over. The Romans were familiar with their customs, and they were familiar with Roman customs. And this familiarity also led Rome to wanting to do things to try to encourage further loyalty to the empire. The Roman government actually made it easier for people to acquire citizenship at one point. And again, the story of Bythus actually talks about how Bythus was rewarded with citizenship after his service in the army. And that used to be the only way to get it, is if you were a non-citizen, if you served in the Roman army for your 25 years, you were rewarded with citizenship. Then your children. This actually served a dual purpose, because you would have children, and they too would go and serve in the army, partly because of your experience, but also partly because the next thing that they would do is they would actually offer land in exchange for 25 years of service. Well, the Roman government made it even easier for people to acquire citizenship. In 212, they actually extended citizenship to all men in the empire. So Rome as an empire, Rome was actually over time becoming less an ethnic identity and more of a political identity. To be Roman wasn't being ethnically Roman. Being Roman was a political identity, in much the same way that being a citizen of the United States is oftentimes seen as a political identity. We have many cultures, but how people in the United States oftentimes define themselves is they define themselves based on their citizenship, their freedom, their rights, not necessarily what defines them culturally. So Rome is actually an ancient example of what really our country is today in some ways. Now, for all the impact that Roman society has had on other peoples also had a tremendous amount of impact on Rome. Roman culture changed the various people of the Mediterranean, but the people there also changed the Romans. You ended up having more non-Romans moving into the capital city of Rome. But you would also find Romans would actually adapt or adopt Greek. For instance, Greek was considered the language of the learned, the educated. The upper classes oftentimes wanted to be educated, have their children educated in Greek, speaking Greek, learning Greek philosophy, learning Greek literature. Greek was the language of learning back then. It was actually very rare to necessarily find people who people from at least the region of Greece who wanted to actively learn Latin. But Greek was something that Romans, at least in Rome itself and in the areas surrounding, they definitely wanted to learn Greek. Alexandria continued to be a center of learning under the Romans. And Rome, and this picture that you see here that I've already had up, Rome participated in the many new religions they encountered. Rome was actually very accepting of other religions, with the one rule being that you could practice your religion as long as you also showed some deference to the Roman gods. If you were willing to do that, the Romans were actually willing to accept you. And the picture here comes from the cult of Mithras, which was actually very popular among Roman soldiers. It involved a degree of sun worship and a type of sun worship. There was also the cult of Isis and the Egyptian goddess, and this is popular because of her promise of assistance in getting to the afterlife. Cult of Mithras had many of the same qualities as that. Romans were free to pick whatever god suited their personal needs, as long as I said, as long as traditional Roman religion remained also equally important. So many of these, what are sometimes termed as mystery cults, were able to survive. And even to a certain extent, the Roman Empire gave some exceptions. For instance, initially, the Jews living within the Roman Empire were allowed to get past having to show deference or pay homage to the Roman gods. And this only lasted for a short while, and then eventually there was a degree of conflict between the Roman Empire and Jews living within the empire. This conflict extended further on to Christianity, which is actually another example of something non-Roman that impacted the Romans and then ultimately became Roman. At first, this became it was a movement. Christianity was a movement that was an offshoot of Judaism, and then kind of took on a life of its own, spread, and became more and more popular in Rome, to the point that it eventually was made it was legalized and then later on made the official religion of the Roman Empire. This is probably one of the greatest examples, and Christianity is one of the greatest examples of something that was non-Roman that had an impact on the Roman Empire. And Christianity's spread is also due in part to the roads, which were built by Roman soldiers. And as I said, Roman soldiers helped facilitate this spread of culture, helped facilitate the good economy that existed. Roman soldiers also helped spread the various ideas from one part of the empire to another, whether it was by way of the roads or by way of the fact that the people who served, the men who served in the Roman army, brought their cultural upbringings with them when they were serving. That's the conclusion of this lecture. And again, any questions that you may have, please post it in the general posting area under the general files on the main page, on the classroom page.